The candles had been lit. The Windsor dining table had been prepared. Senior members of the royal family were already moving through the castle when King Charles suddenly stopped near the entrance and stared toward the open doorway. Prince Andrew was standing there. Within moments, the king issued an order no one in the room expected: cancel the dinner, dismiss the guests, and close the doors. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles entered Windsor Castle believing the evening would calm months of family strain. The ancient royal residence, one of the monarch's principal homes, had been chosen because its privacy could protect the gathering from public attention. Camilla supported the plan, watching him review the final arrangements with cautious hope. William, Catherine, Anne, Edward, Sophie, and a small circle of relatives were expected without ceremony, speeches, or official photographs. This was supposed to be family, not theater. Then Charles saw Andrew. The king froze. He lowered the dinner program, a printed schedule listing the evening's arrangements, and stared at the figure waiting beyond the entrance. Andrew stood in formal evening clothes, certain that the name placed on the revised list had secured his place. Charles did not greet him. He asked only one question, his voice low enough to deepen the silence. Who invited him? Andrew heard it, and his confidence collapsed. The Duke, a royal title given to a senior male member of the family, looked from his brother to the waiting staff, searching for one familiar face, willing to step forward. No one did. Camilla remained tense near the corridor. William stood farther back, controlled and watchful, while Andrew's embarrassment hardened into disbelief. Charles understood the danger. Allowing his brother inside would look like a quiet restoration, suggesting that years of boundaries could be erased by one arrival. Refusing him alone might still leave room for argument. So the monarch chose the most brutal option. He cancelled everything. The order moved through the castle in seconds. Guests were told the dinner would not proceed. Chairs were pulled back, and every place setting was removed. Andrew stayed at the threshold as the doors began to close, while Charles walked away without turning. Yet one mystery burned beneath the humiliation. His brother had not arrived by accident. Someone had placed his name on a revised guest list only hours earlier, without seeking the king's approval. But to understand why Charles was willing to destroy an entire evening, rather than share one table with his brother, the emotional stakes facing both men must first be laid bare. Long before one brother wore the crown, and the other became a symbol of royal disgrace, Charles and Andrew belonged to the same guarded family world. They shared palaces, ceremonies, obligations, and a mother whose presence once prevented their differences from becoming an open fracture. But at Windsor, that protection was gone. The cancelled dinner exposed what neither man had been willing to say aloud. Charles stood alone before the gathering, adjusting his cufflinks more slowly than usual as Camilla watched from across the room. She noticed the tension in his face and asked whether he truly believed the evening would remain peaceful. The king hesitated. Every family decision now carried consequences beyond the castle walls because the sovereign, the person who formally leads the monarchy, could no longer act only as a brother. One warm gesture could be read as forgiveness. One private invitation could be treated as restoration. That burden followed him even into a family dining room. Andrew approached Windsor with a very different belief. During the drive, he told a companion that he had attended family dinners there throughout his life, and would not behave as though he needed permission to belong. To him, the castle was not simply a royal residence, it was part of his childhood, his mother's world, and the family identity he believed no public punishment could remove. The Duke saw private gatherings as separate from official duty, meaning the public work, privileges, and responsibilities attached to senior royal status. Charles no longer believed that separation was possible. The conflict cut deeply because loyalty had not disappeared. Charles still remembered Andrew as the younger brother, protected by the same mother and shaped by the same isolated upbringing. Yet affection had become mixed with anger. Again and again, the monarch felt forced to choose between personal compassion and the survival of public trust. Andrew interpreted those limits differently. Each closed door felt less like a consequence and more like betrayal by relatives who had once accepted him without question. Hurt became defiance, and defiance made every attempt at mercy more dangerous. William had already sensed the risk. In a private conversation before the dinner, the prince warned his father that Andrew's presence would be interpreted as rehabilitation, a gradual return to acceptance and royal standing. Charles listened, aware that the future king was thinking about the institution rather than one evening. He promised there would be no surprises. William accepted that assurance, but the king remained uneasy because he knew his brother rarely viewed boundaries as final. That promise would explain Charles's fury, but the true cause of the cancelled dinner began days earlier with one calculated incident that changed the meaning of Andrew's arrival. The disaster at Windsor did not begin when Andrew appeared at the door. It began 3 evenings earlier, inside a smaller drawing room where a guest list was opened, altered, and quietly returned to palace staff. One handwritten addition transformed an ordinary family gathering into a test of royal authority. By the time Charles discovered what had happened, the car carrying his brother was already approaching the castle. Charles had planned the dinner with unusual care. Camilla, William, Catherine, Edward, Sophie, Anne, and a small circle of senior relatives were expected to attend. The gathering was deliberately limited because the king wanted one evening without another argument about Andrew's position. A guest list, the formal record identifying who has permission to attend a royal event, had already been approved. His brother's absence was not an oversight, it was a boundary. Andrew challenged that boundary 3 days earlier. After a memorial rehearsal, he approached Princess Anne and followed her into an empty side chamber. The rehearsal was a private preparation for a remembrance service, where family members practiced their ceremonial roles before the public event. He told his sister he intended to attend Windsor as the Queen's son, not as a working royal. Anne understood immediately what he was attempting. He was separating family blood from public duty and daring Charles to reject that argument. Anne did not soften her warning. She told Andrew that arriving without personal approval would place the monarch in an impossible position. Charles would either humiliate his brother at the door or appear too weak to enforce his own decision. Andrew listened without apologizing. He insisted that family belonging could not be cancelled by palace procedure. She answered that forcing the choice would not restore his place. It would destroy whatever private flexibility still remained. Then the guest sheet changed. A revised copy reached Windsor only hours before dinner. Andrew's name appeared in handwriting beneath Edward's, followed by a short note claiming that family approval had been obtained. The addition looked simple, almost casual, but its meaning was explosive. No signature confirmed who had authorized it. No direct message from Charles supported it. Someone had either altered the list, persuaded a staff member to accept the change, or deliberately created confusion at the final moment. Charles received the document while preparations were already underway. He studied the added name, then set the page down, with such controlled anger that the aide beside him stepped back. Camilla saw his expression tighten. William, already aware of the original arrangements, understood that the promise of no surprises had been broken. The king refused to send a warning ahead. He wanted no telephone argument and no last-minute negotiation. Whether Andrew had added himself, influenced another person, or misunderstood Anne's warning, as permission no longer mattered. If his brother crossed the threshold, Charles decided the answer would be delivered face-to-face. And when Andrew finally reached the entrance, the years of avoidance ended in a confrontation so quiet that every word carried the force of a royal command. There was no grand argument across a crowded hall, no raised voices, no theatrical display. Charles walked back toward the entrance after ordering the dinner stopped, and faced Andrew with only a narrow stretch of stone floor between them. Around the brothers, aides lowered their eyes. Andrew expected an explanation. What he received instead was a boundary the king had delayed enforcing for far too long. Charles stopped directly in front of him and dismissed the nearest aides with a small movement of his hand. The corridor tightened around the silence. He looked at Andrew and said, "You were not invited, and you will not enter." The words were quiet, but they landed harder than any shouted command. Andrew stared back in disbelief, insisting that his name had appeared on the list, and that canceling the dinner punished everyone simply because his brother refused to tolerate his presence. The king did not move. He told Andrew the problem was no longer one meal or one altered sheet of paper. Again and again, his brother had treated private access as a path back toward public acceptance, forcing the monarchy to absorb the consequences of every boundary he refused to respect. The monarchy, meaning the institution built around the sovereign and the royal family's public duties, could not survive endless confusion between personal forgiveness and official restoration. Charles had allowed that confusion to grow for too long. Andrew's anger turned personal. He invoked Queen Elizabeth II and argued that their mother would never have allowed one son to be turned away from the family home by another. The reference struck Charles immediately. His grip tightened around the folded dinner program, and for one brief moment, the monarch looked less like a king than an older brother carrying grief he had never fully expressed. But he did not retreat. He answered that their mother was no longer present to carry the burden of Andrew's choices. William remained farther down the corridor, tense but composed. The prince had long believed this boundary was necessary, yet watching his father enforce it brought no satisfaction. He saw the pain in Charles's face and the humiliation in Andrew's expression. Still, the future king understood that stepping in would weaken the moment. This had to come from the sovereign himself. Andrew made one final attempt. He asked whether Charles was speaking as his brother or as the king. The monarch held his gaze and answered that Andrew's actions had made it impossible for him to speak as only one. Then Charles stepped aside. Andrew almost moved forward, but the gesture was not permission. It was a signal to security. No one touched him. No one needed to. The stillness told him everything. The conversation had ended, the threshold would not open, and the family line had become a royal command. Yet Charles's command carried weight only because the balance of power inside the family had shifted, and one figure had quietly made retreat impossible. Charles gave the order, but he did not reach that decision in isolation. Behind the cancelled dinner stood a deeper struggle over the monarchy's future, led by Prince William's refusal to let family sentiment erase institutional boundaries. The future king had watched previous compromises create confusion, resentment, and public distrust. This time, he made clear that welcoming Andrew would carry a cost Charles could no longer postpone. William had become more than an heir, waiting quietly behind his father. He now carried growing influence over decisions involving the monarchy's long-term credibility, family discipline, and the line between private affection and public status. The heir is the person next in line to inherit the throne, and his cooperation matters because the crown must appear stable not only in the present, but in the future it promises. Charles remained sovereign and held the final authority, yet he knew that no lasting royal strategy could succeed while the prince believed the institution was being weakened from within. William entered the private room before dinner and placed the revised guest list on Charles's desk. He said nothing at first. He simply pointed to Andrew's handwritten name and waited. The king looked at the page, then at his son, already knowing what the silence meant. The prince chose his words carefully. Allowing Andrew to attend, he warned, would not be seen as kindness. It would look like a deliberate reversal of every boundary the family had announced. Charles reacted with frustration. He accused William of seeing the problem too clinically, as though Andrew were merely a risk to be managed, rather than a brother carrying years of damage and isolation. The future king did not raise his voice. He answered that he was trying to protect his father from being cornered again. Each exception, he said, made the next refusal harder. Each private compromise created another public expectation. Camilla waited until William had left before speaking. She saw the anger beneath Charles's restraint, and understood that the choice was tearing at him. The Queen Consort, the title used for the wife of a reigning king, told him that canceling the dinner would cause pain, but allowing it to proceed would weaken every decision he made afterward. Charles listened because she was not asking him to punish Andrew. She was asking him to accept responsibility. The king finally reached for a pen. He signed a short instruction stating that no last-minute guest amendment could be accepted without direct approval from the sovereign's office, the staff responsible for carrying out the monarch's official decisions. The order was brief, but its consequences were not. Andrew's attempted entry would now bring tighter access, reduced family contact, and a formal clarification of where he stood. By the following morning, the closed door at Windsor had become something far larger, a new reality that Andrew could neither dismiss nor privately negotiate away. Mourning did not soften what happened at Windsor. It made the humiliation permanent. The dining room had been cleared, the guests had departed, and the official explanation had already been reduced to a harmless scheduling change. But Andrew knew the truth. Charles had cancelled a royal family dinner rather than allow him inside, and by sunrise, new instructions were already reshaping the limits of his life. Andrew sat alone the next morning with an untouched breakfast tray beside him. He read the brief message once, then again. Future attendance at private gatherings hosted by the king would require direct personal approval. The instructions sounded simple, but its meaning was severe. A private gathering was a family event without public duties, yet even that space was no longer automatically open to him. He folded the message once, then again, pushed it away, and told an aide that Charles had turned a family disagreement into an official exclusion. The consequence reached Windsor almost immediately. Castle staff received updated orders requiring confirmation before Andrew could enter any gathering arranged by Charles. The household, meaning the staff who managed the monarch's residences and daily operations, was told there could be no assumptions, no last-minute additions, and no informal approval passed through relatives. The message was clear because the previous confusion had nearly forced the king into public weakness. This time, the boundary would be written into procedure. Charles felt no victory. He stood beside a window while Camilla informed him that the instructions had been implemented. She then asked whether he wanted the dinner rescheduled. The queen consort spoke gently, knowing the question carried more weight than a date on a calendar. He agreed. The gathering would go ahead with the original guests and without Andrew, proving that the dinner itself had never been the problem. His brother's presence had been. Anne contacted Andrew privately by telephone. She did not defend him. She reminded him that she had warned him not to force the confrontation, and said his decision to arrive had removed the quiet flexibility Charles might once have offered. Andrew answered with bitterness, but she refused to soften the truth. By testing the limit, he had made the limit permanent. Edward felt the strain next. He admitted to Sophie in a private conversation that sympathy for his brother still pulled at him, even while loyalty to the king demanded restraint. She urged him not to undermine a boundary Charles had paid an emotional price to establish. Edward understood, but understanding did not make the choice painless. Andrew finally asked for one meeting. No officials, no lawyers, no courtiers, the senior advisors who served the royal household. He wanted Charles alone, not as sovereign and subject, but as one brother facing another. For the first time since the doors closed, the conflict moved away from guest lists and palace instructions, leaving two brothers with nothing between them except the truth. The second meeting was nothing like the first. There were no waiting guests, no security officers at the threshold, and no members of the family watching from the corridor. Charles and Andrew sat opposite each other in a small private room with the door closed. One wore the burden of the crown, the other carried the anger of exclusion. Neither man could hide behind ceremony any longer. Charles entered alone, removed his reading glasses, and placed them beside him before taking the chair opposite his brother. No papers waited on the table. No aides stood nearby. The king had rejected a prepared statement because this conversation could not survive official language. Andrew began defensively, insisting that he had never intended to embarrass anyone. Yet as the silence stretched, his anger weakened. He admitted that every missed dinner, memorial, and private gathering made him fear that he was disappearing from family life entirely. Andrew's confession changed the room. He explained that arriving at Windsor had been an act of desperation, not confidence. The more doors that closed, the more he felt erased from the family that had shaped his whole identity. Charles listened without interrupting, but sympathy did not erase consequence. He told his brother that excluding him was painful, yet defending him repeatedly had damaged trust with William, the household, and the public. The household meant the network of staff and advisors responsible for supporting the monarch and protecting the crown's daily stability. Their confidence mattered, because unclear boundaries created chaos far beyond one family argument. Charles finally admitted his own sadness. He said there were moments when he wanted to act only as a brother, but the crown followed him into every private room. Andrew then asked the question he had avoided for years: was there any path back? The monarch answered carefully. Private compassion remained possible. A return to royal prominence did not. Royal prominence meant visible status, official duties, and a recognized place near the center of monarchy. That door, he said, was closed. Andrew reached toward a cup, but stopped before touching it. The movement exposed the defeat he could no longer hide. He admitted that standing at the entrance had forced Charles into a decision, and conceded that the king could not allow the challenge to succeed. The monarch placed his hand flat on the table and told him the boundary was permanent, not punitive. Charles offered one limited compromise. Private contact could continue under agreed conditions, but official events, strategic family gatherings, and unapproved appearances would remain forbidden. Andrew accepted without gratitude, yet he accepted. He left through a side corridor by arrangement, no longer demanding the main entrance. The choice was quiet, but its meaning was final. Family connection would no longer equal royal access. That private acceptance changed the conflict inside Windsor, but outside the castle, the cancelled dinner had already become a national symbol of judgment, loyalty, and the crown's refusal to look backward. By midday, the official silence had failed. A single image transformed the Windsor confrontation into a public reckoning. Andrew standing beside a dark vehicle near the castle entrance, his shoulders rigid, while the illuminated windows behind him suggested a gathering from which he had been excluded. The photograph did not show Charles. It did not need to. Britain immediately understood what the closed door meant. The next morning, one newspaper placed the image across its front page beneath the headline, "Dinner ends at the door." A smaller line declared that Charles had cancelled the Windsor gathering after Andrew arrived. The front page became more than a report. It became a verdict, a royal household statement, meaning the official response issued by palace staff on behalf of the monarch offered only a brief explanation about altered family arrangements. That restraint mattered, because silence from the palace often speaks louder than a defensive denial. The evening broadcast pushed the story further. A presenter opened with a split screen showing Windsor Castle on one side and Andrew leaving on the other. The incident was framed as the clearest boundary Charles had imposed since becoming king. Some viewers saw overdue leadership. Others saw a family so damaged that one man's arrival could collapse an entire dinner. Either way, Andrew remained at the center of the storm. Outside Henry VI Gate, the entrance used by visitors and staff at Windsor, a small crowd gathered beneath umbrellas. One woman raised the morning paper and said, "This was not an accident. This was the answer." Her words spread quickly, because they captured the public mood in a single sentence. The cancellation had become proof that Charles was no longer willing to let private affection blur public responsibility. William watched the coverage briefly, before turning off the television. The prince disliked seeing a private family boundary become national spectacle, yet he remained convinced the decision had been necessary. He understood that the future king could not inherit a monarchy still trapped in confusion. Andrew, meanwhile, stared at the same front page with visible bitterness. He placed it face down, knowing the image of him outside the door would define the incident more powerfully than any statement he could release. Charles refused demands for a fuller explanation. In a private conversation recorded in a household account, he said the monarchy must sometimes accept temporary embarrassment to prevent permanent confusion. The king knew the headlines would hurt, but he also knew retreat would hurt more. Once the headlines faded, only one question remained to be answered. Not whether the dinner had been cancelled, but what Charles's choice had permanently changed. The cancelled dinner was never truly about food, protocol, or a mistaken guest list. It was about the moment King Charles finally accepted that preserving family peace could no longer come at the cost of royal clarity. Andrew arrived believing blood would guarantee him a place inside. Charles closed the door because he understood that the crown could survive one painful evening, but not another surrender of its boundaries. Charles allowed the dinner to be held again with the original approved guests. That choice settled the central truth. The gathering itself had never failed. The problem was Andrew's unapproved arrival and the challenge it created. The sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch who holds final authority within the royal household, could not allow private family access to become a way around decisions already made in public. By rescheduling the evening without changing the guest list, the king showed that the family had not collapsed. A boundary had simply been enforced. Charles paused at the rescheduled dinner beside the place where an additional setting had briefly been considered. For a moment, the monarch said nothing. Then he quietly instructed the staff to continue without alteration. William saw the hesitation and understood the emotional cost behind it. The prince offered no celebration and no words of victory. He gave only a brief nod, acknowledging that his father had finally drawn the line the future monarchy required. Andrew remained at home while the gathering went ahead. He did not rage, release a statement, or attempt another challenge. He sat in silence and accepted that the closed door had not appeared without warning. It was the consequence of a boundary he had chosen to test. The pain remained, but so did the truth. His private connection to the family would continue under restricted conditions, yet he no longer possessed an assumed right to enter gatherings hosted by Charles. The brothers reached a final understanding without pretending the damage had vanished. Charles did not erase Andrew from the family, but he refused to let brotherhood overrule kingship. His brother did not receive restoration, but he was given an honest definition of what remained. Royal birth could create lifelong family ties, yet it could not guarantee permanent access, authority, status, or protection from consequence. The cancelled dinner ended years of ambiguity. Charles chose institutional duty over emotional avoidance. William saw the crown protected. Andrew finally understood that belonging to the family was no longer the same as standing inside its public circle. When the Windsor doors closed that night, they did not close on a temporary disagreement. They closed on the illusion that the monarchy would always sacrifice its future to protect its past. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.